Hey Franny, when I'm coding and I want to check if an integer is truthy, 0 is false and 1 is true, right? 1.
Welcome to Headless WP Rocks. If you've watched this channel for any length of time, you likely know by now that I'm a big fan of WP GraphQL. This is a free and open source plugin that provides a GraphQL data layer to allow your backend WordPress site and your front-end JavaScript application to communicate back and forth. I spent years building up a skill set working with traditional monolithic WordPress sites and knew how to debug those pretty well. But when I first stepped into the headless WordPress space and started working with WP GraphQL, some of those debugging methods didn't quite work anymore. I had to kind of tweak my skill set and learn some new methods for debugging headless applications. So in this video, I'm going to share with you everything I know about debugging specific to headless WordPress apps that use WP GraphQL. All right, so with that, let's get rolling. I put together this list here where in one column on the left, you have the debugging method that you might have used on a traditional monolithic WordPress site. And in the right-hand column, you have kind of an equivalent that you might use in a headless WordPress environment. Now, these aren't exactly one-to-one mappings. There are like kind of differences between these. But I think the thing that is on the left versus the right in each column achieves the same end goal. They're kind of in the same spirit while you're debugging apps. So I think this is a helpful little table to reference. Also worth noting is the WPGraphQL.com doc site also has its own debugging page. So a lot of the debugging methods that we'll see in this video have written documentation here. So be sure to check that out as well. So for this video, we're going to be using this run-through history app, which if you watched my last walkthrough video, should look very familiar. This is the app that we did a detailed walkthrough of. So I have the front-end app living here, localhost 8000, and then I also have a WordPress backend here, and the two are communicating back and forth using WP GraphQL. So what we'll do in this video is just walk through these items one by one and see how we can debug this app. So we'll check out this top line first. So on the left, we have WP Debug Display. Now, if you've done any WordPress development, you may be very familiar with that. It looks something like this, where your constants are defined, usually your WP config file here. You set these constants to true, WP Debug, and then WP Debug Display. And then if you have any issues, they appear on the front end of a traditional WordPress site. So if I say, fake function like that somewhere in my code base, and now I try to load the front end of a traditional WordPress site, then you get these errors popping up here. So call to undefined function, fake function, and then you get a call stack as well to see what called what to arrive at, or result in this fatal error here. So this can be helpful just as quick visual feedback as you're coding that something has gone awry and need your attention. You won't get these popping through in a headless WordPress environment, though. You can't use WP Debug Display. So the question is, what do we use instead of that then? And the answer is we can do this. Enable WP GraphQL debug mode and then inspect our response errors. So let's see what that looks like. So here in my front end app, let me pop open the DevTools and we will induce an error here. Let's say on our back end when we're creating our runs. So maybe I'll throw this fake function call right there. And then from the front end app, I will try to add a new run now. So I'll say on December 10th, I did a 2-mile run. All right. So I'm going to click add here, and then we're going to watch our network requests. And now it has an internal server error. So if you pop open the DevTools and go to the network tab, you might think, well, I'll just see if there is any error text indicating what went wrong. So that would be this one, the create run mutation. you can see all the variables here that were passed from my front end app to the WordPress backend. So this is helpful even at this level, just to see, did I target the right, operation in GraphQL, and then did I pass through all of my arguments? Did these all look correct? And if all that's good, then you can take a look at the response that came back. So I'll go to preview here, and you can see I do have, for data, it says null, and for errors, I do have errors, but they're very non-descriptive here. You can see it just says internal server error, and that's about it. And in fact, I get a hint that I should turn on debugging in the extensions portion here. It says, debug, and then debug logs inactive. So we're going to see how we can fix that next and get something more descriptive than just internal server error here. In the WordPress admin here, if you have the WP GraphQL plugin enabled, you can go to its settings page and then click this, enable GraphQL debug mode. So we'll click that and hit save changes. There's also a way to force this to be on all the time. If you read the WP GraphQL documentation, it's possible to also define a constant like that. But for us, we'll just use the checkbox to turn it on for now. All right, so my settings have been saved. So now let's try that request again from our headless front end. I'll just give this a reload. All right, so here we are back on add run. So I'll say the same thing. On December 10th, I did a 2-miler like that. I'll clear out some of these requests, and we'll try to send this again. All right, so we still got our internal server error, but this time we should have more debugging data available to us since we turned on debug mode. So I'll click on the request, and now look at all the detail we have. So the debug message is call to undefined function, run through history. So there it is, fake function. So you can see how helpful this is. I would recommend, as you're developing locally, just go ahead and leave debug mode on all the time. So then when errors come back and you're inspecting things in the dev tools here, you'll have a lot more information about what went wrong. Many times having these extra debug messages come through in your responses will be enough info to go on to track down and fix the bug, but not all the time. So my next question for you is, what do you do if this isn't enough? If the debug message itself is blank or non-existent, and you are still having errors thrown in your front-end app, how could you test this further? So at this point, what I would recommend doing is trying to isolate whatever GraphQL request is being sent, trying to test that in isolation inside of the graphical IDE. So I'll show you what I mean. So back in the WordPress admin here, under GraphQL, the GraphQL IDE, or otherwise you may have this link up top as well for GraphQL IDE. These lead to the same place. So if you click on that, it'll lead you here, and this is where you can compose queries. So you can say query get posts nodes, and then for each node I want the database ID and the title, let's say. So you can fire off queries like that. For this site, I have none. I do have a runs post type though, so if we do that, then we should get some data back. So here are all the runs that have been logged. This is helpful just for composing your queries, and you can use control space to get autocomplete, so you can see all the fields that are available at each point in your query, as well as compose them using these checkboxes in the GraphQL Explorer off to the side. So all of that's really helpful for composing your queries. You can also use this page for testing as well. So we'll see that next. So let's try to isolate this problematic query, as I said. So in my front-end application, I'm going to find the add run form. That's the one where I'm actually taking the user's input and firing off this create run mutation. So you can see I'm taking the client mutation ID and then the date and miles that the user had typed in, and I'm calling this create run mutation and passing all of those in. I'm saying I want my post to be published, and I'm trying to create a new run using that data. And then after it's created, just get some data back for that mutation in the response. So what we can do here is copy this entire thing, and back in our IDE, we'll paste that mutation in, just like that. So now we have to simulate passing these variables in. You're not going to be able to run it just like this. It'll say you're missing variables. So what you can do is expand the bottom portion and then pop open some curly braces And using that control space technique, you can autocomplete what the variables are here, or what the input arguments are. So this simulates the user, typing in that data into the date and miles fields, and then when I hit the play button here, this data will be passed into my mutation at the top and ultimately used when the create run mutation is run. So let's try that now. I'll hit the play button and we'll see what results we get. All right, so we still get our same debug messages here that we saw on the front end, and that's great that you see them here as well. But what if we need to debug things a bit further? How do we test like certain variables, for instance? So that leads to the next point in this little table here. So we talked about displaying the errors all the time by enabling GraphQL debug mode. On a traditional WordPress site, though, if you want to debug things a bit further, or specific things, just spot check certain values. A lot of times you use die or WP die or var dump, things like that, just to print out values to the page, just to quickly check that values are what you expect them to be. But those things won't work in a headless environment. Instead, we can use a few different functions. So we have WP Send Json. That's one we'll check out next. And after that, we also have GraphQL Debug. So let's start with the WP Send Json. All right, so for this query, let's say, as I said, the debug message wasn't clear enough. Something's still going wrong. I need to dig in and inspect some specific values. So if I go to my backend code base here, I can do a few things. I can say WP Send Json, and then anything I put inside of here will be converted to valid JSON, and then the server will send a 200 OK response to the client with whatever that JSON is. So we'll see that pop through here. So this can be very helpful for just checking values. So let's say I wanted to check to see that my input arguments are what I expect them, like that run and the miles that I had entered. Let's say I just want to check what those are at this point in the code to make sure they're what I expect. So I can pop the input in there and I'll hit save. And now when I execute this query, you can see what comes back. So instead of the usual data that would come back in GraphQL, instead I'm kind of short-circuiting things. I'm saying just when you hit this line, return valid JSON, and here's exactly what I want you to send. So at this point in my code, I can see, okay, the client mutation ID was 123. That checks out. That's what I sent in. The miles are 2.5. Is that what I expect? The date was this, and then the status was publish. So using this, data can often be very helpful for, as I said, just spot checking values as you go to check if things are, what you expect them to be. So that can be super helpful there. Another one we should look at, though, is GraphQL Debug. So this one, as the documentation says here, can be thought of as console.log for WP GraphQL. So let's see how we can use this. I'll copy GraphQL Debug, and then here inside of our backend code base, I'll call GraphQL Debug, and we'll pass in that same input argument here. Back in our GraphQL IDE, we'll go ahead and fire off the mutation and see what we get. All right, so you can see, unlike WP Send JSON, GraphQL Debug actually allows this mutation to finish, and the same would be true of queries. So it actually, the GraphQL operation actually fully executes, and you get the data back that you had requested. However, you do get debugging data in the extensions section here. So under debug, you can see here's what I'm getting back. So the message that was sent for this, the type of GraphQL Debug, which is the default, if you don't specify any other type, which we'll see in a second, would be this. So you can see here's the input data that I had passed in, and you even get a call stack as well, so you can trace back all the calls that led to this point in the code. Let's take a look at this type value next, right here. So if you'd like, you can pass a second argument into GraphQL Debug. That's a config array. So in here we can say the type is something different. We can say this is the input args. breakpoint, since that's what we're testing here. And you can even tack on arbitrary values as well. So you can say hello world, or whatever other key and value pairs you want to throw in there. Now when I execute my query, I'll get that coming through. So yeah, so the type of breakpoint, the type of data I'm logging here, you can see is now input args. If that's helpful for organizing your debugging data here, you can see I even have my extra hello world being passed through. So you can tack on additional arguments here that you want to see come through ultimately to your front end and be logged like this. The next line item I have is if you're using something like Postman or another REST API client, the similar solution would be to use the Graphql IDE, which we've been using this whole time. As you can see, it's pretty powerful for being able to debug things. One additional thing, though, I would recommend doing here for full visibility into what's going on with your GraphQL operations is to pop open the dev tools and go to the network tab right here. This gives you a lot of insight into what's going on. So we'll fire off the create run mutation here and see what we get. So there we go. You can see this is the GraphQL request. And just like before, you can dig through the headers. One more thing to note about using the embedded Graphql instance here, and that is related to authentication. So when I fire off a request, I'm actually being authenticated as this logged in user. If I fire off a request and I click on that, we'll see that in the request headers right here, all of my cookies are being sent along with the request. So WordPress is able to authenticate me and then send back the results to queries that I would only be able to access if I had the capabilities of an administrator because I'm logged in as an admin. If you wanted to test queries that, that would require like a different user role or different capabilities, you would either need to log out and then log into WordPress as a user with that role or with those capabilities and then test your queries here. Or alternatively, you can use just a standalone Graphql instance. So I'll show you what that looks like. So if you just Google Graphql, note the I right there. This is a free open source app. And it's the same web app that's embedded in WordPress here, except the standalone one here doesn't send any cookies along with it. So you can see I've plugged in the GraphQL endpoint to my local environment here. So if I do this runs query right here that does not require authentication, I should get the results back because that's public information. This is a post type that doesn't require any authentication. So you can see I am able to get the results back there. But users wouldn't be able to query everything. So this would be something that shouldn't be public and available in our public GraphQL API. So if I try to fire that off without any kind of authentication, you can see I get back the person's database ID and then their name, but other things I'm trying to get, like that person's capabilities, I just get null. And that's because I'm firing off this request as an unauthenticated user. So any fields that require auth like this, I'll get null back for. It's possible to do authenticated requests here. If you go to the edit HTTP headers section, you can add your own like authorization header here. And if you use JSON web tokens, for instance, you can manually add some headers here and get auth working with a standalone Graphql instance like that. But typically for me, I just pop this open if I want to test something unauthenticated. And then if I want to do an authenticated request, that's when I would do it from the WordPress admin here. Okay, and next on our list, we'll take a look at WP Debug Log. And this one still works, just as it does in traditional monolithic WordPress sites. So if you're not familiar with this, this is a way of just logging values to a file, to a debug.log file that lives on your web server, and then using that data for debugging purposes. So in our backend, we can open WP config again, and I will uncomment these, but instead of debug display here, we will need WP debug log. So if you have both of those constants defined as true, then this will work. So I'll go ahead and save that. And then inside of our create run mutation, let's go ahead and make use of this new logging capability we have. So PHP has a function called error log. Anything you pass into that gets printed to the debug log file. So Let's try that. I'll say post ID, and here maybe we'll make this a string. All right, we'll say post ID is equal to, and then we'll print out what the actual value is. So I'll give that a save. And then back here in Graphql, let's fire off our request, knowing that in doing so, this function has actually executed, and these lines right here have called the error log function. So once that's happened, I should be able to go to my WP content directory. You'll find a new file here, debug.log. So this one, if I open that up, you can see post ID equal to, and then I get the value printing out there. So that's super handy. And this can also work for non-scalar data structures as well. So if I want to take a look at our input array here, for instance, I'll swap these out for input. And this won't work just like this. We have to turn it into a string. So you can say print r input and then true, so that it does not get echoed to the page, but rather print r returns a string. So if I hit save now and execute our create run mutation again, now when I check my debug log, here we go. So you can see input is equal to, and then it's an array. And because we ran it through print r, you can see all my values coming through in the log right here. So that debugging method is unchanged from traditional WordPress sites, like I said, but still, very viable and very helpful to be able to print to a log file. And next, we'll cover this line related to using Xdebug. So if you're not familiar with Xdebug, it's a very popular and powerful debugging tool for PHP. It allows you to set breakpoints in your code and then let it execute. And when that line is hit, the debugger will pause execution and then allow you to kind of poke around. You can check the values of different things to make sure they're what you expect, and you can even run expressions, as we'll see, to check things on the fly and get really into the nitty-gritty details while you're debugging. On a traditional monolithic WordPress site, you typically use Xdebug on page load. So you set your Xdebugger to start listening, and then you reload the page, and when that reload happens, that's when your breakpoint is hit, and you can start debugging. In a headless environment, though, we need to do things a bit differently. Instead, what we can do is use Xdebug and have it triggered by Graphql requests in the WordPress admin. So as a reminder, Graphql is just this embedded app that we've been using so far. When requests are fired off from here, we can have those break on our Xdebug breakpoints. So let's see how we can set that up now. So I'll flip over to our backend code base here, and we'll get started. What I'm about to show you assumes that you're using VS Code for your editor and Google Chrome for your browser. So if you're using something different from those, these steps may vary a little bit, but they should be pretty close here. So first in VS Code, we need to make sure we have the proper extension for even working with Xdebug. So I'll go to extensions here, and if you search for Xdebug, you'll see a few options come up, but this is the one that I use. It's PHP Debug by Felix Becker. So if you install and enable this extension, then you'll be all set. Once that extension is enabled, you can head over to the run page here. At this point, VS Code will look for a launch.json file in your project. And when it doesn't see that, it'll prompt you with this message. So you can click this to create a launch.json file now. So I'll go ahead and do that. When it asks you to select the environment, choose PHP, and then this file will be created. So you'll see this added to your project inside of a .vscode directory. You'll see a new launch.json file, and it looks like this. So it's set up a new configuration called listen for Xdebug, and that's the one that we're going to use. If you have a non-standard file structure to your WordPress project, like it's nested multiple levels or something like that, sometimes it's necessary to specify an additional path mappings parameter here. But for us, because we have a standard WordPress install on our file is just at the root directory of it, this will work fine, just right out of the box. So since we have that file ready to go, now if we head back over to the run page, we'll see that in this dropdown, we have our configurations listed. So we'll go ahead and choose the first one right here, listen for Xdebug. So at this point, we're ready to go to set breakpoints and start using Xdebug. We'll pause that just for a second though, and go grab the Chrome extension that we need to make this all work. So in Google Chrome, if you go to the Chrome Web Store, you'll need to find this extension, Xdebug Helper, offered by Rep. So if you install this and then head it over to your WordPress backend right here, you'll see this icon. So if you just installed it, it may be grayed out like this. It may be gray and set to disabled. So what you'll need to do on this page is click on that icon and click on debug. So you'll see that icon turn green there to show that it's active now. So in my backend code base, I'll go ahead and we'll go back to that create run mutation that we were working with previously. And if I'm on the run screen right here, we can see what's going to happen. So let's try this first. So you can see toward the bottom here, you can tell it what you want to break on. So notices, errors, warnings, exceptions. So this is really helpful if there's a problem with your site to have it just stop execution and pause right at the moment where that problem exists. So I'll click everything right there just so that it stops on all of these issues. And then let's induce a problem here. I'll just type a bunch of gibberish, I guess, something to throw an error. All right, so I'll save it with that. And now we'll try to fire off our request. So before we do that, I'll turn on my debugger. So you can hit the play icon up here. And at this point, our debugger is active and it's listening for Xdebug requests. So from the WordPress admin, I'll hit the play icon here. All right, and there it is. So we actually didn't hit my error that I was trying to intentionally create. We hit another one here. So an exception is being thrown elsewhere in our code base. So I'll hit this icon to go to the next one, and here we are. So now we've arrived at inside of create run right here. It's flagged this parse error right here. So I type this gibberish and it's encountering that as an error. So this can be super helpful if errors are being thrown in your front end requests. If you turn on Xdebug and just tell it to break on everything, it'll stop right wherever the problem is. It'll jump you right to it. So that can be huge for just saving time while you're debugging. So I'll go ahead and stop right here, and I'll just kill that current request, and we'll go back to square one with these lines. So let's say that my problem wasn't that an error was being thrown in the front end. It's that my data was just wrong. The response I was getting back looked a little off. I just want to double check to see if some of these values are what I expect. So what I'll do here is click right here in the margin to set a breakpoint. So this is where we want our debugger to stop, right at this point. And then make sure you have clicked the play button there and that you see these icons to indicate that your debugger is listening for those requests. Once you've done that, you can head back over to the WordPress admin here, and I'll hit the play icon once again to fire off this request. All right, so you can see that the debugger is paused now at this breakpoint, just like I wanted. So at this point, you can use some of VS Code's debugging features. So these are pretty handy. Like you can hover over variables, and it'll display in the little pop-up there what these are. So that's hugely helpful. You can just kind of poke around and hover your cursor to see what things are. You can also hit Command-Shift-Y right here, or from the top menu, open up the debug console, and from here you can actually evaluate expressions. So you can see, if I want to see what the name, variable in the local scope equals right here, you can see that that's the answer. You can even run expressions like I said. So WP get current user, something like that, and that gives me back a WP user object from WordPress. So if you want to know what would I get at this very point if I were to execute, this function, you can just go ahead and on the fly type expressions here in the debug console and then get the answer back. So that can be really helpful for debugging issues. I tend to think of this as like the most granular that you can get with Headless WordPress requests. So you can see that here in the WordPress admin, I'm using all the debugging methods, or nearly all the methods that we've learned so far, where I'm using Graphql, I'm plopping in my operation here, my mutation. I'm passing in, query variables to that operation. In the dev tools here, I can find that request and see all the headers that are being sent and the payload being sent to the back end. And then once we get to the back end, I can use Xdebug to pause, for that particular mutation or the particular thing that I want to debug, I can pause that at a certain point and see, what things equal before I go ahead and click this icon here to continue, and ultimately see the response come through on the right-hand side here. So this gives you a very granular and detailed look into what's going on with your requests. And the last two items on our list here aren't so much about debugging per se, but they're more about performance and trying to optimize the queries that are run and how long things take in your application. So perhaps you've used a plugin like Query Monitor. So this is a very popular WordPress plugin here by John Blackburn. And this is for getting a really in-depth look at all of the queries being run for a given page. You can even see the exact SQL queries that are built up and were run for a given page. So it can be really helpful for finding performance issues and more queries that are more expensive than they should be and that kind of thing. So WPGraphQL has a way of doing a similar thing, and it's by enabling GraphQL query logs. So we'll take a look at that now. So here in the WordPress admin, if you go to GraphQL and then settings, we can turn this on here, enable GraphQL query logs. So as it says here, this is a debug tool and can have an impact on performance. So don't run it in production. So for us, because we're on our local, we'll go ahead and check that box and then save our changes. So with that, we can head back to Graphql now and fire off a request, and we'll see that we have added info here. So I've executed my mutation again. You can see what I get back. So the data I expect, plus in the extension section here, you can see I get the query log. So this can be really helpful. You can see how many queries, the total time that they took, and then here are the queries. So as you can see, these are the actual SQL queries that were generated at the end of the day and run against your database to perform the mutation in our case, and also to fetch the data that was required. So you can glance through these and see if any of the queries are too expensive or can be optimized or whatever else. So that can be really helpful for finding performance bottlenecks. And the last one here is related to profiling. So if you use a tool like New Relic or other tools for profiling PHP applications, we can do a similar thing in a headless WordPress environment by enabling GraphQL tracing. So just as we did for the last step, we'll head over to the settings page here. And for this one, we'll enable GraphQL tracing. Okay, so now back in Graphql, I'll hit play to fire off this request. So here's my data I expected. And now in the extension section, you can see we have tracing data. So here's the time the request started, time it ended, and probably the most important thing, duration. So how long this particular operation took right there. From there, you can see some info about like the GraphQL resolvers that were used. So to get each of these fields that we ask for back, they're there, as well as to perform this create run mutation. So you can see the name of the field, what the return type is, and more data about how long things took here. So that's another tool that can be really helpful for identifying which specific fields on those queries took a certain duration or took too long to resolve, so you can find performance issues. So that concludes our video on debugging headless WordPress apps that use WP GraphQL. As I said, when I started getting into headless WordPress and working with WP GraphQL, I felt like there's a bit of a learning curve with doing debugging in a headless environment. So this is the video that I would have wanted. So I hope it's hugely helpful to you and you're able to leverage a lot of these tips and tricks in your own headless WordPress apps. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Did you like that? Go ahead and push that like button. Subscribe.